In the previous video, we saw that how if you have a bad cell connected in series with n number of good cells, how does the overall IV characteristic of the system look? And I want to emphasize again that these good cells in this scenario are producing power, and all that power, a lot of that power is being dissipated in this bad cell, and it's in reverse bias. So a lot of people, they get confused when I say that this bad cell is in reverse bias. So to clarify that by just explaining how the circuit inside this array is functioning. Okay, so each of these cells is essentially, let's say if I think of it as a diode, this is a series connection of a diode which is connected like this. Okay, and these diodes are all forward biased, but they are conducting current in this direction. Okay, so even though they are forward biased, the current is going in the opposite direction, and that's how the energy is being extracted, okay, or energy is being produced out of the system. Okay, but when all that current reaches in this particular diode, okay, it can no longer allow that much amount of current to flow through it. Okay, but all these other good cells, they are trying to force this amount of current through this bad cell. Okay, so what happens is that this bad cell, then it tries to go into reverse bias, okay, where it can conduct a higher current. Okay, and instead of producing power, it's now dissipates power. Okay, and these good cells, they have to put a lot of effort, or in that effort they lose a lot of voltage to try to reverse bias this bad cell such that it can flow that high amount of current. And that can clearly be seen in the overall IV characteristics. Okay, so if we had n good cells connected in series, they were producing this high voltage, and I was able to extract all that power out. Okay, but when I have this bad cell in series, I mentioned that I'm only able to extract maybe the power contained inside this rectangle. And you also see that the voltage at which I'm operating to extract the maximum power is lower, okay, as compared to the voltage produced by these n good cell in series. So all that extra voltage is essentially being used to reverse bias this bad cell such that it can conduct this higher amount of current and let that current through. And in that process, that voltage loss is dissipated in the form of power inside this bad cell, and this bad cell can now heat up, and it can lead to all kind of bad things. So now let's examine how we can prevent that, how we can prevent this hot spot creation if I use a bypass diode. Okay, so what I would do is I would essentially have this bad cell, and I would connect a bypass diode which has the polarity which is opposite of this cell. Okay, what I'll do is I'll connect a diode in parallel with this bad cell. Again, the polarity of all these other cells is like this way. Okay, so they are connected in series like this. Okay, and what I've done is I've connected a diode which has the opposite polarity in parallel to my bad cell. Okay, so let's see now what happened. So now all these good cells, they're essentially forward biased, and they're trying to produce current, and that current is flowing in this particular direction. Okay, but now it can't flow through this bad cell. But since I have this other diode which is connected in parallel, all these cells can essentially forward bias this diode because it has a reverse polarity, so you can forward bias it, and all that current can flow through this diode which is series connected. So it can bypass this bad cell and it can flow around it. Okay, or it can, that's why the name bypass diode. Okay, because it's bypassing this bad cell and flowing through this diode. Okay, so Now, if I have this kind of a connection where I have a bypass diodes connected in parallel with a bat cell, the overall IV characteristics of across these two terminals would look something like this. So I have a bat cell which has a reduced short circuit current, and in parallel to that I have this bypass diode. Okay, so when I try to reverse bias my bat cell, it forward biases my bypass diode. Okay, and this current can flow through the bypass diode. This bypass diode is now forward bias without losing much voltage. Okay, because as soon as I'll try to reverse bias this bat cell, the current can flow through this bypass diode, and I only will need the voltage which is needed to essentially turn on this bypass diode. Okay, so this is how this IV characteristics of my bat cell plus my bypass diode would look like. Okay, so now how would the overall system look like? Again, I can flip this around and I'll find that the short circuit current would essentially, be where these two curves meet, and it would be very close to somewhere over here. Okay, so if I flip this around, and this curve will meet over here. So now my overall system, it would essentially look something like this, where I would lose a certain amount of voltage to turn on the bypass diode, okay, when I'm extracting my power. Okay, and my overall IV characteristics, it would look something like this. Okay, so if I look at how much power I'm able to extract, you see that I'm able to extract a much larger amount of power as compared to the previous case. Okay, so I've lost slightly in my open circuit voltage of the overall system because I need that voltage to turn on this bypass diode. But if I compare to the previous case where I needed a much larger voltage to reverse bias this bat cell. Okay, so as compared to this case, I'm extracting much more power out of this overall system. Okay, and more importantly, that current or that power is being extracted out of this system, and only a small amount of it is being lost in this bat cell. Okay, so the power which was being dissipating in the bat cell, it has gone down substantially, and that would essentially prevent the creation of a hot spot inside this bat cell. Okay, so an ideal scenario would be essentially if with every solar cell you connect a bypass diode. Okay, and that would essentially just, if that something wrong happens to that cell, or if it gets shaded, that current can just pass through this bypass diode. But that's often not economical. Okay, that's not often possible because it costs money to buy all these bypass diodes and connect them in parallel with each of these solar cells. So what's often done is we take a group of these cells and then connect a bypass diode across them. So what you would often do is maybe you would essentially take a group of, let's say, 3 cells over here, and I would connect a bypass diode in parallel to them. Okay, so I would in this string, maybe I'll have 3 bypass diodes. Okay, and now if one of these goes bad, let's say this cell has gone bad. Okay, so now all of these other 6 cells are trying to flow current in this direction, but this bad cell cannot support it over here. So this current will essentially bypass this 3 cells which are connected in series, and it will flow through this bypass diode. Okay, but these 2 other cells which are producing power, okay, that power is still going to be dissipated in this bad cell, and it's going to become a little bit harder as well. But the power loss in this bad cell is essentially limited to the number of cells that you have in series before you put a bypass diode. So we are restricting the amount of power loss, or we're limiting the amount of power which can be lost in this bad cell. And many times you'll find that the way these bypass diodes are connected on a panel is that, you know, they're placed on one side of the panel. So let's say I have a panel which is like this. So this panel, it consists of 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 times 4 36 cells. And the way the bypass diodes have been connected is that you have, you know, each of these cells which is connected like this, okay, which has this polarity like this, and after 18 of these cells you have connected a bypass diode in the reverse polarity, okay, and again after 18 of them you have connected a bypass diode, okay. So if one of these cells gets shaded, okay, so if one of those cells gets shaded, and in this case if it gets extremely shaded, okay, the power which is being produced in this good cell, or the current which is being produced in the rest of these cells, they can flow through this bypass diode, okay, but the current which is essentially being produced in all these other cells, okay, will get dissipated in this bad cell over here, okay. So but we are limiting that power loss to essentially this particular two strings, okay, and only the power which is being produced in this string can get lost in this bad cell, okay. So many times you know, you put them on this short side of the panel. Sometimes if you want to put more bypass diodes, you can also put them on the long edge of your panel, okay. And if you in fact want to see whether these cells are getting hot or not, you can take infrared image of a panel which has been operating, and then the cells which are essentially bad cells or which have been shaded, or where the power loss is occurring and the temperature inside the cell is rising, so it will show up in this signature, in this infrared signature of the panel, okay, and it would show up as these white spot which represents higher temperature. So many a times people, especially who operate utility level plants, they send out these drones, okay, in which essentially hover over the panels and take images of the panels to essentially look at whether there are hot spots being produced or whether the whole panel is getting hot,